Now moving to our next speaker and our last speaker of the day, and we thought it's going to be a good wrap up of the day, talking about the importance of data quality and consistency. So we have Dr. Paula Granados Garcia here with us, and she's going to talk about this important issue and showing us one software that's going to help with some of these data quality, cleaning, consistency. Paula, I hand over to you to share your screen and unmute.
Great. Let me see if I can share my screen properly and you can all see it. Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes,
Perfect.
thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me here today. I've been attending some of the talks this morning and they were brilliant, really interesting, especially the last one, which focuses on also on intangible heritage, which is something that I'm gonna talk about today. And so just to give you a bit of context, I work for a program called the Endangered Material Knowledge Program. We are a grant-giving program based at the British Museum. We were launched in 2018 with funding from Arcadia, and we do research on critically endangered material knowledge. So what we understand as material knowledge is the resources, the skills, technologies, and social values necessary to create and maintain the material world around us. So kind of like in contrast to what museums tend to focus, which is the material object itself, we focus on the making process of those material objects. So we go beyond the tangible and to try and like bridge the gap regarding that information that we are not collecting at the moment in how objects are made, how they are used, how they are mended, and so on. So it's kind of a very specific data set and data to collect from the different projects that we fund. So this is what I mean in terms of like the data that we collect. We do digital documentation. So we do documentation of knowledge systems and practices. And what we mean by practices is anything from houses, textiles, pottery, adornment, anything you can think of in terms of how we as humans relate to the material world around us and how we create things, no? So the sort of data that we collect includes film, interviews, illustrations, drawings, photographs, maps, written records, 3D, 360, and so on. And the idea is that we require this digital documentation to have the capacity to capture movement, action, and embodied knowledge. So a sort of knowledge that is not so easy to capture because it is organic, it varies, it's not linear, it's not easy to capture, it's a kind of more complex than just an object itself. And everything is then published into an open access repository under a CC attribution non-commercial share alike license in a digital repository that is hosted by the British Museum. So, however, this is just to give you a bit of a background, but today I wanted to focus on data quality and consistency, which I think are issues that all of us can relate to. And just to give you a kind of a brief overview of the sort of training that we provide to our grantees in regards to this big issue. So I just wanted to start with a sample of the sort of data that our projects collect. All this data is available in the EMKP repository, and I will paste the links to the repository and the EMKP website in the chat after my presentation. And so as we all know, this is basically a table, which is the most common tool to present and collect structured data. It just shows a graphical layout for presenting information in a structured way. And it was used since ancient times, right? Since Mesopotamia, we have been using tables. And it arranges data in a regular grid. The other good thing of tables is that we can refer to columns, rows, or individual cells as an intersection between columns and rows, as we are referring here to E10. So it's quite easy to individualize the data. And it becomes easy when we name or a number of rows, like what we tend to call a range. So when we say, for example, E10 to D10, and we are referring to a range. So when we start thinking about designing our own database, I always like to mention this book by Lisa Gittelman, which is called Raw Data is an Oxymoron, which I think is a really nice metaphor of this idea that there is no objective data. We tend to think that we are trying to collect data as objectively as possible when we go in the field, because we are just documenting, we are taking photos, we are making videos. But that's never the case. Every data set is a subjective representation of reality. And that is something we need to keep in mind when we start collecting data, because it's sort of a narrative that we are creating, that we are generating about reality. So things to keep in mind when we start designing this database or data set is first identifying the research goal and defining purpose and scope, understanding our data, what we are recording. Keep it as simple as you can, which doesn't mean short, it just means concise, but descriptive. So it has to give information, but in as less words as possible. Plan and record your schema. So we have been talking today about CDOC CRM. If that's the schema you are using, for EMKP, we use a tailor-made schema that we develop in-house for the purposes of the program. Ensure data integrity mechanisms as vocabularies that I'm gonna look at in a minute. Find and create user-friendly interfaces for data entry, query, and visualization. And also, and very, very important, document your process. Whatever decisions you make along the way, make sure you document them, because believe me, you won't remember them in a couple of days, and even less in a couple of years. So it's always very important to document your choices when you are documenting or collecting data. So in EMKP, what we do, as I was saying, is we go in the field and we document these practices via images, photo, video, sometimes 3D modeling, maps, so GIS, and so on. And then when the projects submit that data to us, it has to come together with a metadata spreadsheet that collects all the information, all the metadata about these images. And these resources. So this is something that I always mention. Why is metadata so important? Because it's something that grantees complain a lot about, which is the time and effort that collecting metadata requires. So why it is so important? And I like to show the metaphor of the iceberg. Well, because the metadata tends to be in the background, is mostly overlooked, but extremely valuable, and knowing about it can save us from a huge crash. So being able to collect this information can save us a lot of time in the future. But looking at specific case studies, why it is so important? Well, we can, in my perspective and the perspective of the program, we can look at it in two different ways. First, why is metadata so important in the field of information management? Well, in the first place, because it provides context about the materials. So we are contextualizing the information. It gives access to people because it makes them searchable and retrievable. It allows reuse because when people know what's there and how to access it, they will reuse it for their own purposes. It allows interoperability as well, because if we declare the schemas and the vocabularies that we are using, it will be, other repositories will be also able to use the same information and refer to that information. And it, of all of this together, also allow the preservation, because when data is documented properly, is properly contextualized and can be searched for and retrieved, it then stays, it's preserved in either in the original repository or through the research and projects of people that will come after us, other researchers that will come after us. And then there is also the question of why is metadata important in the field of ethnographic and anthropological research. And this is specific to my program, but there are many archaeologists here, so maybe you will have other perspectives related to your specific fields. But in the field of ethnographic and anthropological research, there are three issues that are key in terms of why metadata is important. In the first place, because it allows us to provide meaningful documentation and archiving. And what this means is that through metadata, we can provide information and context beyond what is visible on the frame or heard in the audio. So if, for example, we are recording something, we can actually explain who is there, why this is happening, this specific event is happening, where it is happening, why we are recording it, and much more information to contextualize these materials. Second, it also preserves community understandings of time, space, and social structure, and it helps to understand data from the community perspectives. For example, if a specific forest is a sacred forest for the community. So it allows us to provide information and of why that we are recording is so important to the community, and if it has any hidden or not so obvious meanings that we should know in order to collect this information and make it available. It also increases community engagement because it helps the community to find the research that we are generating, and it allows communities and knowledge holders to make decisions over the accessibility and reuse of the information. So in terms of data sovereignty and governance, metadata allows us to declare processes of accessibility of the materials. So we can say who has access to it, when can it be accessed, and so on. And finally, it helps to keep track of the data over time. For example, if the location is not there anymore. So if we recorded this sacred forest that had a special meaning for the community, and that forest disappears over time, metadata will allow us to keep track of that specific place over time, which is always very, very important. So then if we go into a more kind of like detailed look at why metadata is important, it's also useful to understand what types of metadata there are. So there are three types of metadata. There is the structural metadata, which is the structure, what type of a structure we are using to collect our data. So for EMPP, we use CSV and Excel. Other people may use XML, or they may use a graph database that uses CDOC CRM as the schema. It really depends on whatever system you are using. There is also descriptive metadata, which is the information about context and context of the data. So who is the author, the length, what it is depicting, what is the information collated in that specific resource. And there is also administrative metadata, which is this information about the rights, management, consent, and preservation techniques, the sustainability, how that metadata is going to be kept and preserved in perpetuity or for as long as possible, right? Because nowadays, every time you apply for funding for a digital project, they are going to ask you, what is your digital sustainability strategy? How are you going to make sure that those materials remain accessible in the long term? So structural metadata, as I was saying, is the sort of a structure that we use to collect the data. And while descriptive metadata changes from file to file, structural metadata won't change generally in your whole data set, in your whole database. So the structure will remain the same. But as I'm saying, the descriptive metadata will change. And that is, as we all know, is the specific information that we are collecting about the assets. Now, here is sort of an exercise that I like to do, which is basically here we have the Excel spreadsheet with the information that we have provided about the different fields. And at the bottom, we have the sort of the guidelines, the conventions that we are asking people to follow at the time to provide or collect data. So for example, for the creator, we see that the convention is surname, comma, name. And instead of that, the person that has collated the data has written Laura Guerra. So they are not actually following the convention. That should be Guerra, comma, Laura. And this is very important because, of course, like, you know, in the Western world context, I could understand that Laura is the name and Guerra is the surname. But if I have to read a name from somewhere else in the world, I may not be able to make that differentiation, and it shouldn't be up to me to make that differentiation. That's why conventions and guidelines are so important. About the place name is the same. So we have town, region, and country. And this is not the case because Mexico comes in the middle. So they haven't followed the convention. And the same with description, because the convention is no special characters. So there shouldn't be brackets here, because that's the convention for that specific column. So in terms of data accuracy, data quality, sorry, there are four key principles that we need to keep in mind to be able that our data has a good quality, and also to be able to measure the quality of our data. So the first one is accuracy, which means to what extent your data records reality. So is your data accurately representing reality? Can you trust your data in the way that it represents reality? As I was saying, it's never going to be objective 100%, but we need to be sure that what we are saying is actually true. Second, completeness, to what extent your data represents a complete picture and not just like a side of the story, if you know what I mean. Consistency, using consistent identifiers and vocabularies across your dataset. This is going to help us a lot to be consistent across the different tables or tabs or sections over the database. Make sure that if we decide to use the word tree with lowercase, we are always going to be using tree with lowercase and never with uppercase, to make sure that that word can be cross-reference across the whole data set, and we'll always be able to find that word. And finally, uniqueness, to make sure that our data is unique, and there are no duplicates of rows or objects or items in our data. So these are the four principles that we always need to keep in mind. And then, as I was saying before, there are also best practices in terms of how to record this data. So as I was saying, it's very good to be concise. So the information has to be simple, complete, and coherent. We need to provide appropriate descriptions, explain the limitations and possibilities to support reuse. So this is very important, to explain what are the possibilities of our data, what our data can do and collect, but also the limitations, because in that way we will be saving researchers time, because we will be explaining exactly what the data set collects or has and what it hasn't. So to explain limitations, but also possibilities. Then no more than one value per cell, unless otherwise stated. That's normally the general rule, but of course, unless there is another rule in your database. Avoid special characters, provide persistent identifiers and permanent links when possible. And if we copy information across, try to use a text editor to avoid hidden characters, because sometimes if we copy information from the web or from other places, it actually has hidden characters that can break our data set when we process it. Another way to ensure the quality of our data is data validation. So data validation is the process of ensuring the accuracy and quality of data. There are many ways of doing data validation. Just if you use Excel and Google spreadsheets, there are different ways, different features to allow data validation. One of the most common features is to create a tab with vocabularies that then you can specify have to be used in that specific column. So whenever you want to insert an attribute in your column, you need to pick one of the words from one of these vocabularies that you have declared. So in that way, you are validating the data, you are making sure it is consistent, and you are making sure that it follows the conventions and the list of terms that you are defining. It also has its disadvantages, of course, because when you list all the terms that can be used, you are restricting your data, you are making your schema or your database less flexible in that sense. But again, it can also be a negotiation between you and your collaborators, your partners, and decide which are the words that can be added, and also, of course, always be open to keep adding words and terms to those lists. That's always a really good practice. So as I'm saying, One of the most common ways to validate your data is to use controlled vocabularies to facilitate the quality of documentation, findability, access, and long-term preservation of data. And what these vocabularies do is that they provide standardized terms and language to describe artifacts, objects, concepts within the specific domains. Some of the most well-known vocabularies are the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. I think there is another one for archaeology, the Getty Thesaurus for geographic names, or other geographical gazetteers, which are list of names, also across time, which is, list of place names, also across time. So it's really interesting because you can see how a place changes name across time. And you can make a reference to that specific place in that specific time, which is really, really useful. And these records, these enriched records, include URLs that provide preferred concept labels in multiple languages, alternative labels in multiple languages, and broader and narrower concepts. So the fact of being able to also include multiple languages in your data is really, really important and really encouraged. And this is something that we really also encourage in EMKP, because we want to be able to represent the information in the local language, which is also going to improve access in the long term, so that the community will be able to access this information in the local language, in the language of these materials themselves. So that is really, really important. So be able to translate the metadata, to make it available in multiple languages, to also make the internet less English focused. And this is a really good tool that I like to suggest, to recommend for people to use, which are tools to map vocabularies. So there are two that are really good: the vocabulary matching tool of the University of South Wales and the vocabulary matching tool by the EU Horizon Ariadne Plus project. And these tools are really useful because they allow you to match terms across vocabularies, and they allow you to compare the terms across vocabularies, so you can see what exact term is going to be most appropriate for you to use. And I always recommend people to look at these vocabularies, because when you start putting together data from scratch and collecting data from scratch, you may not know exactly what word is best, if it's going to be, I don't know, settlement or community, or what do you mean by a community, or what do you mean by a building, things like that. It's really useful to have a look at these vocabularies first, to see and understand what are the meanings and how those terms are defined internationally and across resources. Another key issue of data consistency is data identifiers. So it's very, very important to define and consistently use a suitable file name to keep track of your entities. So they have how these identifiers sometimes are automatically generated by your system, which is really good. Other times they are not, so they need to be minted by yourself. And if you mint them, you need to have a convention. You cannot just start generating them, but rather think them through, because they need to collect information that allows you to at least identify the asset just by looking at this identifier. So they have to be unique, of course, they have to be consistent, they have to be simple, they have to be descriptive or informative. Of course, they cannot be very long, they have to be short, but they can give you some sort of information, as for example, the project date, or the number of the asset within the data set, or the location, or what sort of, you can think about what sort of data you need these identifiers to collect for you. They have to be immutable, and they need to be validated. So you have to have some sort of data validation in that column to make sure that you are not repeating these identifiers, because it's really important. And so the best way to making sure that all these recommendations are followed, and that your data is going to be consistent and clear and of good quality, is to put together a data management plan, which is also one of the most common things that are required when you apply for a digital cultural heritage project. So these plans are formal documents that specify how research data is going to be handled before and after the project has finished. And they are fundamental to ensure the quality, the coherence, and the survival of the data during and after the research project. The main objective of the data management plan is to consider aspects that will play a role in the data management process. So, for example, the data collection, metadata generation, data preservation, and storage. And there is not such thing as an ideal plan. It's always going to depend on the specific purposes of the project. So the things you need to consider in terms of putting together your own data management plan are the deadlines of your project, fieldwork schedules, data processing time and effort, and any other features and circumstances that are unique to your specific project. So it's really important to understand and familiarize yourself with the data requirements of the funding or the project or the resource, the database that you are using. Identify the data to be collected, so formats, sources, and volume. Describe how the data will be collected, organized, and documented. Design a data storage and preservation strategy, and very, very important in my perspective is to assign roles and responsibility to the different team members. In my perspective, this is very important because this is going to allow us to track if something goes wrong. So if any of the steps in the data processing goes wrong, we can actually go to that person and see what happened, identify what the issue was, and see how we can solve it, which is also very related to this idea of trying to document our processes, our decisions. So if we assign roles and responsibilities within the team, like for example, backing up data, there is one person that is going to be in charge of backups. It's really useful to know that person is looking after that, and I can go back to that person if something goes wrong in that sense. So it's really, really interesting. And I just wanted to finish recommending a very good tool, a very powerful tool, which is called Open Refine, which is a tool that I always recommend and that we use a lot for working with messy data. So to clean data, to transform it, and to allow you to do very quick commands across very large data sets. And it also has a feature that is really useful if you work with linked open data, which is called data reconciliation. So Open Refine actually has the possibility to reconcile your data with other reconciliation services available. So things like Wikidata, or Nomisma, which is a big linked platform for numismatic collections. So it has more. Also, the Getty vocabularies have a reconciliation service, so you can use this software to reconcile your data sets, and we use it a lot. So it's very easy to use. They have a help service and a lot of tutorials for you to have a look, but basically, because I don't have a lot of time, I'm just gonna give you kind of a brief overview of how it works. So you can download the software and you just unzip the file and run the executor and it will open. So it's a kind of a strange software because it runs in your backend, but it opens in your browser. So it will open a new tab, a new screen in your browser. And you can go into your browser and then you just you browse and you select the files you want to work with. It also can select files from Google data. So if you have a spreadsheet on Google Docs, and it can also extract data from web addresses, from URLs. So it's really cool in that sense because it can take RDF data from URLs. Like if you are using a gazetteer, one of these geographic names dictionaries, you can actually download the data from a URL from a gazetteer and play with it in Open Refine. So this is a database that I used a long time ago, which is about archaeological sites in late Iron Age, the late Iron Age Iberian Peninsula. So there is the settlement, architectural urban remains, and ethnicities of the peoples. But I wanted to import the data here just to show you how it works. So you can see that you have all the different columns here. And you can play and to see how many rows you want to show, how many records. You have the column headers that allow you to play with the column, but also with the cells themselves. So for example, you can edit the column, split into several columns. These are easy commands that you can do with Excel, but it also has much more powerful things, like for example, when you edit the cell, it's not here, I think. Yes, when you edit the cell in Common Transform, you can actually trim the leading and trailing white space, which is really useful because you can remove white spaces that tend to really break. You can turn to uppercase, lowercase, change the format. You can split cells, join cells. It's really powerful in that sense. You can manipulate cells. There is also a way of doing text facets. So you can actually group words by type, like how similar words are. And that is gonna allow us to find inconsistencies in your terms and the words. So it's really useful in that sense. And there is also, as I was saying, the data reconciliation feature, which allows you to reconcile your data with reconciliation services online. So there is Wikidata reconciliation service, and there is also the Getty vocabularies. So you just select a column to reconcile, identify which kind of word you want to reconcile, and then set up the reconciliation service if you haven't, or if it doesn't come up, and then just click start, and it will start to give you terms that it has identified in another server. So if you are using words like, I don't know, city names in southern Spain, like Seville, Cordoba, things like that, it will provide the links for those words in other data sets like Wikidata or the Getty thesaurus. So it's really, really powerful and useful in that sense, in terms of reconciling your data. And you can also go back to if you want to undo and redo, you just go back to the project history and you can undo whatever command you did. So it's really good. So this is, yeah, as I said, this is a software that we recommend. Feel free to have a look, and I'm always happy for the organizers to share my email if anyone has a doubt or a chat or whatever. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Paula, for this amazing and comprehensive presentation. If there are any questions now to ask Paula, but as Paula said, if you have any other questions, we can share Paula's email now that she agreed, and then, or you can write in the chat and we can send along as well. But please raise your hand and unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Hello.
Yes, Mary.
Thank you, Ma. Thank you for giving us this opportunity and for organizing this thing. Very, very interesting. Please, my question is that concerning this software that she shared, is it self-explanatory that one can easily use it? I mean that Paula shared.
Yes. So this is an open source software. So you can just go, if you type in OpenRefine, you can download it in your machine and start using it. And there is also a book that explains how to use it that I can share with you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to share the link to the software in the chat if anyone wants to download it.
Thanks, Paula. Any other questions? Sure. There will be more once you start to use this OpenRefine, and then yes, but I mean, we started this workshop with the importance of data quality consistency, and this was a great wrap up to conclude the workshop. Thanks very much. Okay, we're a bit over time, but thank you for all the presenters and for all the participants for staying with us today. And I hope that the workshop was useful for your working with data, either where if you are working with analog data and started to digitizing, or digital data and you want to organize it. So thank you very much.